Good afternoon, everyone who's just joined. Thanks very much for joining OnePlanet session on joining up the planning process. We'll go through the five sessions, just a very brief intro from a few of the speakers, and then going into a breakout session on kind of the national level connections. Then look at a very specific case study in Haringey, and then have a breakout session on that. So there'll be about two 20-minute sessions with presentations, and then two 20-minute discussion sessions, and then a wrap up. And really, we want to look at what are the key issues that planning can help us address, and how we can help speed up and smooth out the planning process by joining up these issues. So just in the first session, we've got Puran, Masha and Mark, who will just give an overview, and I will hand over to Puran to start off.
Thank you everyone for joining. My name is Puran Desai. I'm founder of OnePlanet. I've been working in sustainability for about 35 years. Spent a lot of time working with planners and architects actually around the world, getting in planning permissions and entitlements and finding ways of connecting the dots on those. But having worked in sustainability for that length of time, the thing I really take away from it is that sustainability is all about understanding interconnectedness. For example, what we build determines how much we use our cars. If those cars are internal combustion engine cars, they're creating pollutants, damaging our health, they're contributing to climate change, supporting the oil industry, which also creates single-use plastics, which end up in the oceans, filling our fish up with plastics. If we choose to eat those fish, we fill ourselves up with even more microplastics. In fact, probably every cell in our body now has microplastics in it. My own background is actually in medical sciences and neuroscience, so follow this quite closely. And it turns out now, for example, if you've got narrowing of your arteries, if that narrowing is high in microplastic pollution, you're 4 times as likely to get a stroke. So it really is starting to impact our health. But those plastics are also killing penguins on the other side of the world. So everything is interconnected, but we don't have the tools to visualize or manage or nurture those connections. And in fact, as a society, we're tearing our hair out trying to deal with issues in silos. So, for example, we might try and deal with the cost of living crisis in a way that just makes the climate emergency worse. So, we're not going to solve our problems or the world's problems by trying to address individual issues. Instead of that, can we take a deep breath, get out of the weeds, look at the bigger picture, and think about, okay, what are the outcomes we want to achieve? Can we come up with a set of joined up, shared outcomes? And then can we collaborate on those shared outcomes across traditional silos, whether those silos are public sector, private sector, voluntary sector, silos of organizations? We're often quite siloed in what we do. Not necessarily very good at collaborating across organizations. And even in larger organizations, different departments are siloed, not least, of course, in local and central government. So can we be more joined up across all those silos? And that's really why we have built OnePlanet as a way to help us collaborate on shared outcomes, breaking down traditional silos. And for me, really planning is at the forefront of creating a better future, because it does determine our health. It does determine environmental outcomes as well. So very pleased to be at this event today. Thanks, Ben.
Brilliant, thank you, Puran. So, Masha, I can hand over to you to give your intro, and I'll try and smoothly share the platform.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you, Puran, as well, for so eloquently setting us up for today's session. So welcome to joining up the planning process. My name is Masha Ige, and if we go on to the next slide, I'll just briefly introduce myself as Urbanist on a Mission. So obviously, as a town planner, I've spent the past few years working in the private sector. I've also acted as the Climate Emergency Engagement Officer for Kensington and Chelsea Council. So really taking all that different experience together, my passion was all about trying to connect the dots between planning and creating sustainable places. It's a really fantastic tool for delivering on not only climate action, but also all the other areas that planners are so familiar with. So whether it's looking at biodiversity, health, like Puran mentioned, and so many other things as well. There's really a lot of scope to use planning more effectively. So between planning support, events like today, social media engagement, I think there's a whole lot we can do to raise awareness about the potential for planning. So then if we move on to the next slide, of course, it wouldn't be right to start a session like today without defining some of these different areas. So I thought it was interesting to take this extract from the National Planning Policy Framework to really think about this line at the beginning that says the purpose of the planning system is to contribute to the achievement of sustainable development. Now, that is very powerful because essentially it's putting quite a lot of pressure on the planning system to essentially be the mechanism by which we achieve a more sustainable local context, but also beyond that, regional and globally as well. And we see a nod to this in the second paragraph that defines sustainable development as meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs as well. So although the narrative at the moment is very heavily focused on building, which we know that, of course, we need to do and we need to use planning to achieve, ultimately, there's a sort of long-term view as well that we can't forget. So yes, build the houses for today, but actually, how are we impacting future generations to be able to build their own, not only build their own houses actually, but actually live in them in a healthy and sustainable way as well. So if we move on to the next slide, I mentioned sort of this emphasis on build, build, build. We saw that in the last government. And for those of you who aren't familiar, it's really been clamped down on with the Labour government as well. We have this proposal of 1.5 million new homes across the next 5 years. So really ambitions are ramping up. But if we move to the next slide, that doesn't mean that we've forgotten about all the other issues that planners are contending with. We are trying to balance housing delivery with net zero, so reducing our carbon impact, exploring embodied carbon, navigating climate emergency impacts, which we're seeing increasing at a rapid rate. So things like flood risk, heating, shading, all these things that need to be considered. Air quality, of course, waste, we mentioned biodiversity, net gain, and an important aspect of that is not only incorporating these as part of our applications today, but remember we talked about the future. So what is the enforceability of these issues? How are we checking that they're done properly? Is that even feasible given the current system that we are in? And then, of course, you know, the list goes on and on. So we're all familiar with nutrients, water neutrality, health, heritage, community, and then even beyond those sort of core planning elements, we're also talking about cost issues, skills, knowledge, resource and retention as well. So, you know, it all sounds quite doom and gloom, but actually I think there's a huge amount of potential here, like Puran said, to take a step back and say, is the way that we're doing this the most efficient and effective for delivering on all the different things that we need? And I'd say the good news is we're not alone as planners. There's so much great work going on at national scale, right down to community level. So whether it's, you know, sort of something like the MPPF or the biodiversity team having their own action plan, climate action plans, air quality plans, you know, there's a lot of different objectives that generally align with one another and that have some resource behind them. In some cases, some great amount of funding behind them as well. But we're not quite connecting and collaborating in a way that means that we can work together and use those resources effectively in a targeted and focused way as a whole. So that brings me on to the next point here and hopefully the purpose of today. So we're very lucky to have perspectives from academics, applicants, officers, different people who work within the planning process to really shine a light on where they see joining up as a potential avenue to really using resources better. And I've mentioned 3 points here around what we could look at when it comes to the mind mapping that OnePlanet promote. So firstly, thinking about simplifying this process and make it more engaging. I like to use the example of somebody who's interested in planning, goes on the council website and wants to learn about what the council are doing and just don't even know where to begin. You know, even between all the different documents, it can be really clear, but I don't know how many of us spend our evenings reading through hundreds and hundreds of pages of different objectives, even when they're really interesting. Unfortunately, you know, it's not the best way for all of us to have that meaningful engagement with the process that we want to have essentially. So something like a mind map can be a really exciting way to just see all the different objectives in one place, be able to click on one area that might be more of interest and see how that links with other areas as well. And we'll take a look at an example in a moment. But then this idea of reducing duplication and consultation fatigue. So like I said, if all this great work is happening in multiple different places, by bringing that together into almost one source of truth in a way, it just means that somebody in one department can say, oh, look, actually the housing team have already done a piece of work on this and they've already consulted this area. So we can use that information to inform our planning policy, or we can use that information to inform our strategies. And then even from a community perspective, it just means that people aren't being sort of asked the same questions over and over again, and maybe feel more inspired and trusting of a more transparent process for them. And then finally, this idea of templating. Of course, as a planner, I will always say there's no such thing as sort of one way of doing everything. Each site has to be looked at specifically based on its circumstances, and every site will have its own key considerations. But ultimately, if we know we've got SPDs, so supplementary planning documents and guidance, that tell us what good design looks like, that tells us what the energy efficiency goals are, by putting that all in one place and allowing applicants to almost plug into these existing objectives, that we can sort of help shape the developments that we want to see in a bit more of a sort of concise way. So Ben, if you open up an example for us, I think it's always easier to show these things in practice. But we've got a case study later on today with Andrew showing a project that he's done in Haringey and how that's been mapped on the OnePlanet tool. And I think what's interesting about this, if you zoom in, we looked at those different outcomes around good design, sustainable transport, reducing waste, and then within those objectives showing the actions that were taken as part of the proposal to try and achieve them. And going on to filters, I think this is the bit that I get really excited about, is beyond just the proposal itself. Once you start layering up different documents, so for example, we've got the Haringey Council vision. If we click on that, we can start to see how some of those actions also feed into the objectives of the council. And then we've got the Mayor's London vision, we've got the MPPF. So the possibilities on this are endless. If there was a local plan from a policy perspective that you could almost just visually look at, how much of this am I addressing, what areas am I not addressing, and why? Are there conflicts between some of these policy points in terms of my particular project? It just opens up a conversation that's hopefully more targeted towards achieving that sustainable development that we know we want to see. Obviously, easier said than done, and I think this is a good point to pass on to Mark. He is going to tell us a little bit more about the overall planning structure across different scales. Thank you, Mark.
Yeah. Thank you very much, and thanks for the invite. Thanks, Poran and Ben and Masha. Really great to see all the work that you guys are doing for OnePlanet and Urbanist on a Mission. I think it's really fantastic and promoting the planning system. So yeah, if you can go on to the next slide, please. Ben, by way of introduction, my name's Mark Dobson. I'm a lecturer in planning and development at the University of Reading, and I'm really pleased to be speaking about these kind of issues here. Apologies, my slides will be a bit different, and you might feel like you're back in a lecture theatre after a number of years, but I promise I'll go through the issues quickly. When I was given this brief, I was just thinking, okay, well, can I set out some of the general context to why joined up working is so difficult in the system that we're working in the minute? I think given the audience we've got, we can take it as a given that everyone sees the potential of the planning system that touches on a number of really important areas that we have to get right, that the stakes are high, but at the same time, there's quite a number of barriers to its effective operation. I'm not going to talk about a number of them because we're all very well aware about the resources issue that local authorities have. We all know that there's significant issues around capacity, different knowledges and skills, the increasing scope and complexity of planning, actually as a discipline in a number of things that people are being asked to do, often quite positive things, but requiring a lot more expertise and evidence. So if we look at, the introduction of biodiversity net gain and what that means, really important, but a huge another layer of practice that kind of people have to get to grips with. So I'll focus on 2 points, and I'll focus mainly on the spatial governance and mainly on the timescales. I think in terms of outlining the picture from the kind of national to local level, one of the main issues I think we have at the minute is that we don't really have a national level plan. We have the MPPF, which is okay, it's fine, but it's effectively an aspatial document. There's no maps or land use framework within it. So it becomes very useful for setting out key definitions or helping local authorities to understand how to make their local plans, how to affect decision makings, especially where local plans aren't up to date. But beyond that, I think we really need to make sure that we have a national level plan that sets it out. And I know that the House of Lords in the 2022-23 session have already started looking at creating a land use framework, understanding we're a relatively small island and that land's going to have a lot of multifunctionality to meet the competing pressures that we have, for housing, for nature, for other things. In terms of examples, I didn't get to go down to regional. Ben, if you could go back one, that'd be great. We don't have regional governance anymore. That was all wiped away in 2010 and replaced with local enterprise partnerships that were meant to reflect functional economic areas, and then a kind of cross-boundary duty to cooperate between local authorities. And effectively what we've got is a patchwork of different devolution deals for city, region and combined authorities, different unitary two-tier authorities. So it's a bit of a patchwork at the minute across the country. There's no consistency. And we had a shift towards localism. So we have neighbourhood planning, which is better because it's closer to people. But then again, is it fair and responsible to ask local people to be dealing with these big level issues on their own and without higher levels of governance? If you take an example, when we're looking at the levelling up, the TCPA was very clear that actually it's fine to have resources and to put that in, but unless you've got a strategic plan for how you're going to address issues, effectively these agendas can fall flat on their face. And I think that interconnected stuff is really important. Planning is absolutely key to that if we mean that we're going to join these things up more than kind of policy slogans. And so I think a nice example of this is the National Planning Framework 4, which sets out the kind of national framework for Scotland. You can see it's indicative, but we could do that in England as well. You know, it's very kind of broad brush, but we can outline where our key areas for development are, for infrastructure, for housing, interconnectedness. At the minute, nothing really happens above the local level, and that makes it very hard to connect and join these things up. Another issue that's really important is, well, what are the actual timescales of planning? Because again, the 8-week minor and the 13-week for major applications, these have remained unchanged broadly since the inception of the system. But we all know that planning has increasingly become more complex in the scale and the issues that we're dealing with over time. And effectively, you could argue that we're living in a time of polycrisis or multi-crisis and multiple issues that need to be joined up together. It's alluded to in the other 2 slides that we've had so far about a climate crisis, nature and biodiversity crisis, housing crisis, cost of living crisis, health crisis, trust in democracy crisis. All of these create a sense of urgency. And they all demand action, but taking a step back, we need to have a clear plan for how we're going to address that and deliberate what the issues are. I think the urgency paradox forces us to act when we don't fully understand the issues and complexity, and then things get introduced into practice where we're not really exactly clear what there are and how to do it. And I think Biodiversity Net Gain might be an example of that in terms of learning as we go. I think the right action requires that deliberation, collaboration, strategy and leadership. And I think just trying to speed things up to get things done can squeeze practices and make it harder to address these kind of wicked issues. And again, I'd advise against seeing not just having one planning time, but multiple planning times. So we know that developers, investors will have their own priorities and timescales that they need to do, obviously subject to issues around viability and investment and project management. We know national politicians have got their own timescale. The Labour government have got 5 years to try and deliver on their agenda. Local councillors as well, the way that planning committees and local plans go through affects the decisions they make. Planning officers, community groups, statutory constituencies, landowners, all of them have different operating scales and expectations of the system that don't always neatly fit together and can make it very hard to join up collaborative working. So I put an example in here. Developers trying to build trust and dialogue with community groups can take time. but then at the same time, this can jar with those business and viability timeframes for delivery. So again, these timescapes can privilege or marginalise some different actors and interests, and often it's the sustainability element that sometimes becomes marginalised in that. And of course, you've got the short-term versus long-term goals. I'd say the example here, the Labour government's still coming out with the speed and growth agenda around time, but climate change hasn't come front and centre in the same way it does in the NPF4, which is an example I showed before. And I think we can kind of go back to the future here and say we were still talking about these issues under the new Labour government back in 2001. They had a programme for delivering fundamental change, one of them speed of delivery, but an assessment from this effectively said it's about quality of decision making. A lot of the decisions we make now will have an impact into the future, and we need to take time to make sure that we get those right. So speed for the sake of it is a false economy. So I guess if we're thinking about planning as a resolver of conflict, we need to make sure that we've got the right governance for it, strategic planning in particular coming back, but we also need to make sure that we have the right timescales and understanding for it. And I think this comes back to not just the actual spatial structures and timescales, but actually fundamentally getting back to what the purpose of planning is. And we saw that at the top of the NPPF. What are we planning for and why?
That was fantastic. Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mark, Masha, and Brian, for giving that introduction. So we wanted to provide there is kind of overview of the challenge of what we think planning may need to address, and also some of the challenges in delivering effective planning. We're going to go into breakout groups now to give everyone an opportunity to talk. So we'd like you to consider 3 questions. So what are the issues we need planning to address? Where does the system need the most support to deliver those? And who should be leading on this? And then to feedback one key issue you think needs addressing and one area of support. So yeah, we'll go into the groups. You'll have a facilitator there. If you can just briefly introduce yourselves, your name and organisation, have about 15 minutes to discuss these points, and then we'll come back, and it would be great if someone, not one of the presenters, could just present back these 2 points at the end. Just hoping one person from each group could just feedback kind of one of the issues that they thought planning could be addressing, and some support that is needed to do that. Marcia, if you don't mind starting from our group, that would be great. And then if OnePlanet person can identify someone from their group, that would be great.
Okay, so the issue that planning needs help with really is behavioural change. So local residents objecting to new houses, whereas actually we want to see new houses with, say, solar panels and electric vehicle charging as a positive thing that should be encouraged. And then what additional support would be funding for local authorities?
Brilliant, thank you. Felix, from your group?
Joe, I don't know if you want to talk about anything or pick up anything you were talking about.
Yeah, I think I was ranting on. I got quite passionate. I think my biggest issue that planning needs to address is looking beyond the building. I think a lot of my research looks into going beyond the physical structure and looking more into the communities. And I think that lies the problem. We look at buildings, we look at structures, but not necessarily the communities and what's happening to the building now and what will happen to the building in future, which is causing this huge issue of demolishing and not repurposing, because we look at the building, not the communities that inhabit them. I think that we need more support from central government, because the private sector will not necessarily act without something that's pushing them, which, yes, I'm speaking from the private sector, we want to push and we want to be more environmentally conscious, but without central government pushing that, I think there'll be some people who won't necessarily take on the challenge as much as it's needed to.
Brilliant, thank you. Masha, your group?
Yeah, so we had Daniel taking notes down for us. Daniel, if you'd like to share.
So there were 2 planners and then Hani from the Quality of Life Foundation. And the issue that was introduced began as upfront carbon or embodied carbon, and the consequences of that for an agenda which is build, build, build. So it's the opposite of that, and making use of what we've got. And then there were 2 comments which I made. One was the efficient use of stop. So if you're going to stop development, how do you make that efficient or effective? And again, it rose again in conversation that there's too many people joining the planning system saying no, so they shouldn't be allowed to do that without saying no, but the consequences of the no. And then the leadership, the support we need is from the communities, wherever they are. And we're 2 planners, and I think the planners should have a different role to play. If they're not going to be controlling new development, then they have to be more involved in adaptation and sweating the assets or making best use of what we've got.
Brilliant. I think that's really clear. Thank you very much. There should be one other group.
Yes, we looked at with our main issues, and I think resource allocation was really big. The political landscape. One good point that we had was the central government. We've got central government saying we need more houses, and then in certain areas you've got Greenbelt. Obviously, everyone knows we need more houses, but nobody wants it on their own doorstep. So there's kind of that relationship. Another good point was, there's a lot of untapped land out there, whether it's disused garages, disused bits of land. I think we were saying that wherever you go, there is a unused garage or a shop that's not, that could potentially be made into a couple of houses, than taking away all the, football pitches or local parks, whatever it might be. And then for ourselves, with systems we need more. So I think coordination was a real big factor that came out from numerous people. How a lot of areas are still working as silos within local government and not speaking back to each other. And then we looked at obviously who should be leading on this. We believe that central government should initially take the lead, but we need more resources locally to help people and also educate the general public as well.
Brilliant. So there's a lot of agreement there, maybe on who should be leading and some of the resources needed. Picking up on the point of untapped land and unused garages, I'm going to hand actually straight over to Andrew.
Hello.
Hello, great. I will share the slides.
Different Andrew.
Right, yeah, different Andrew Wallace. Let me share the slides, Andrew, and you can just take us through an example.
Yes, thank you, Ben. So yeah, I'm Andrew Wallace. So my wife and I just spent the last probably 7 years building our own home, finding land and then building. It's been a long journey, but yeah, we live in Muswell Hill, North London, so in Haringey. We're downsizers, sort of empty nesters, if you like. So, but our passion is in good design, good architecture. We've always wanted to build a very sustainable home, low energy as possible, passive house standards, so you get clean filtered air, because we've had health issues in our family. So we really recognise the benefit of that. And yeah, so that was our aim 7 or 8 years ago, and we were going to have to build our own home to do that. You don't get those sort of places on the market. So yeah, back in 2019, we looked around the local area. We stayed very local because we want to stay where we are now. And you can see from those 3 pictures, that's 3, but we actually started searching and found, I think, about 167 viable building plots, and wrote to the owners through the land registry. Had some very interesting meetings with people, and in 2020 we found the top picture there. So that is our current home, but that's right, it's the top picture there, that garage with a nice looking mattress outside it. So yeah, we went, so it's 2020, I think. So next slide, we went for a pre-application submission with Haringey Council. So the top picture there is what we went for. So a little eco build, 2-bedroom, timber clad. But the feedback we got was that we were in a conservation area, so they only wanted 1 story above ground level. and they wanted us to match the materials of the conservation area, which was brick. Now we didn't have time to go into different options. We did a resubmission to meet those demands. So the bottom picture, you can see our little house. That was the planning approved we got. So we got that. And the next slide, there's a couple more pictures of our planning application that was approved. So as you can see on the right, you can see a small house. There's 2 bedrooms in a basement. You can see the rear. There's a sunken courtyard all the way down to bring light into the 2 bedrooms. And that's all we needed for us empty nesters in the local area. So in 2022, we started, it took us a while to find, we changed architects. We wanted someone with more experience building to passive house standards and using as highly sustainable materials as possible. Non-toxic materials as well. We had a long wish of things we wanted to incorporate. So we had to, because we were digging a basement, we had to use reinforced concrete, of course, for that. But the ground floor, we used cross-laminated timber because of its sustainability and health benefits. And you can see it in the bottom right-hand side. The timber frame for ground floor went up very quickly. And yes, next slide. So this is it today. We've nearly finished. We're not quite there. But I'm going to talk about just 3 items really where we feel we could have done better for the planet and ourselves. But it was only until we'd gone through the planning approval process, we'd gained planning, and we went into the detailed design and construction phase that we realised there was perhaps better choices that could have been made to reach our goals of a highly sustainable, low energy home. But it was a bit too late, and the opportunity might have been missed because we were locked into a contract with a big builder, and any change or any delay costs us money. So 3 items there I've mentioned. So start with the facing bricks. So as I say, we're in a conservation area, so the advice was not to use timber clad, but to use to have a brick finish. But as I said before, we used timber construction on the ground floor, so we would have loved to have timber facade, but we had to stick with our planning conditions of brick finish. So these are actually brick slips. So very carbon heavy. You have to make and fire and dry the brick, and then you you slice the front face off the brick, and you stick it on the outside of the house. And the whole carrier system to mount the bricks on, it all cost about £30,000. So it's extremely expensive for us, and it was very carbon heavy item. And if you see on the photograph on the left. Sorry, on the left there, you can see that, we've got quite a low profile house. We've yet to do all the vegetation that we've agreed to do around the building. So we have not done timber clad to save a bit more of the planet. But we couldn't afford the delay and to reopen the decision really. So yeah, the next slides, that was on construction of a basement. So again, because we're in a conservation area, we're advised that just single story only, which really pushed us down into a basement, which we went for to get planning. But the cost of doing that in terms of carbon footprint, you can see there we had 50 spoil wagons of London clay to remove. We've got a lot of concrete in there. It's not the best material. And it's often, I think, on other sites where small sites gain planning by going into the basement. I think you see a lot of them that have never been built, certainly around here. We've got planning applications 10 years old that have never been built because it becomes financially unviable. So they don't even get built in the end. So but we went ahead with ours, but yeah, we burnt a lot of carbon, I'm afraid, that we didn't really want to. And the other example, we've got a nice big flat roof there. So we've got solar panels at the rear. So there's a plan drawing actually at the bottom there showing 4 solar panels at the back. The photograph shows looking where the solar panels are laid, looking forward, so you can see the roof lights are there. So the idea is we'd have a living roof on there. We would have really liked to have that discussion. We might still have that discussion, having more solar PV cells, because we've got such great, fantastic insulation with 4 times better airtight than a passive house standard. So with a few more solar PV panels, we could actually be passive house positive, which means we generate more electricity per year than we use. So we become a little power station. And perhaps we could achieve the biodiversity by other planting around the site. So there's a bit of a trade-off there between and the surface water runoff as well. So just to conclude, really, so yeah, there's hundreds of these viable sites in Haringey, I believe. We got showing the house to lots of our friends. There's a big demand for this. We know a lot of people in a similar position where they want to downsize. They're in a big 4 or 5 bedroom house, but there's no housing stock for them to move into. Yes, that's to wrap up, I think, Ben. Yeah, that's fine.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you very much, Andrew, and congratulations on getting through that journey. And I think what's really interesting about today, we actually have now Matthew from London Borough Haringey, who was the planning officer responsible for kind of managing this on the other side. So he was going to give his thoughts on kind of supporting small plots. Over to you, Matthew.
Yeah, thank you. So just going to give a quick reflection on small site development in Haringey. And as Andrew's pointed out, this is quite a prevalent form of development, but equally it's a costly type of development. From my experience, I think it tends to be architect led. In a lot of cases, it tends to be an architect who wants to actually live in the house themselves. Just looking at Haringey itself, so Haringey, for people who may not know the borough, it's in a borough in North London. It's neither an inner nor outer borough, but its characteristics are primarily an urban borough of identity, varying building typologies, good levels of green space. Conservation areas, approximately 25% of the areas covered by designation as conservation areas. I think as a borough, I think I would say that we're fairly progressive in that we do support urban growth, both in terms of regeneration and small scale development, with the council itself playing an important role in the last few years in delivering 1,000 new council homes. But I suppose ultimately we have to work within the constraints of the planning system before us, which tends to be a very hierarchical system. Again, reflecting on what Andrew has said, have been many small site developments, many of which have won design awards. This is one which won the REBA House of the Year last year. It's called the Greenhouse. It's in Tottenham. And it was constructed on land to the back of, just go back to the previous slide, constructed on land to the back of a house backing onto an access road, contemporary nature, taking inspiration from the former greenhouse which sat on that site. Next slide. Angel House, equally another design award scheme going back a few years ago, a site which in effect just replaced disused garages. Next one. This one's actually relatively close to where Andrew lives. It's in Hornsey, Sycamore House. It's a passive house, timber structure. It sits in the grounds of apartment blocks, so it uses what was extensive grounds more effectively, but equally retains a sizable garden for the flats in question. So just looking at some of the positives in terms of small site development. Small site development is kind of a concept which is now kind of very much become embedded in planning, stemming from both the London Plan and National Planning Policy. So there's now firm support and recognition of small site development, obviously seen as a critical instrument to provide more housing, rather than continuous greenbelt development. Or the updated the NPPF puts great weight to the benefits of using suitable sites within existing settlements for homes. Somebody made reference to garages in conversation earlier on, and critical garages equally. Garages and former developed sites, from our experience, are really critical in allowing small scale development. The London Plan equally has assigned a small site target for boroughs. So typically about a quarter of its housing targets should come from small sites. So I think that's quite a positive development, in that it's really kind of pushing us to look at stock more effectively, what small sites can be used as best as possible. Equally, our local plan has a policy on infill backland and garden land development, which kind of gives perhaps a better framework for designing such applications. But equally, I think it's a somewhat restrictive policy. So in terms of the reality, I think, yes, while there's all these aspirations and recognition of small sites and sustainability, I think the reality when you apply these policies and so on is that they're not very tailored to small site development. Our planning system is very much a heavy top-down system. A lot of times policies they start higher up in London Plan, they apply to major applications, they filter down, and then apply to smaller sites. So a lot of cumbersome reports are required with many relatively small applications. There's often then a tension with other policy areas, in particular heritage, as Andrew kind of somewhat alluded to, with heritage often taking precedence. I would say that's primarily because it is a statute consideration. So you're dealing with a legal consideration. You take a wrong step as a planner on such an issue, and there's a possibility of challenge on such a decision. So it does bring into consideration how these kind of difficult competing issues are dealt with. Perhaps I think it needs more guidance from central government. A lot of bureaucratic hurdles, Section 106 agreements, requiring things to be car-free, some cases affordable housing contributions, all kind of cumbersome and legal documents that have to be prepared, inevitably slowing down the process. Also, I think the planning system tends to be burdensome in terms of planning conditions. There's a lot of conditions now placed on relatively small schemes, making it difficult and costly post-consent to implement planning consent. Again, as reflected in Andrew's presentation, the design of a scheme as initially perhaps thought and that approved can be very different. Changes can kind of be sought, which can make a scheme quite expensive. And last point is that I think such development is still often strongly resisted by local communities, again making it somewhat difficult to achieve this type of development. So in summary, I suppose some points, some areas where I think there's perhaps need for change. I think the planning system needs to allow more flexibility. We need to move away from this hierarchical system, top-down, national planning policy, London, local planning, local policy sitting below. I think local authorities need to kind of they themselves be able to come forward with ideas. How do we, as a borough, enable small site development? Obviously, there's been various initiatives that the government have kind of introduced. This idea of permission and principle was something that was talked about a few years ago, and it's still there. But in reality, it's not really an instrument. It requires local authorities to provide a land registry of sites. I think that's not an effective way. I think we need to allow people themselves to kind of come forward with sites. They apply. Can I get permission in principle for this site? Make it somewhat easier. Give more certainty to a person if they want to come forward with a site. Equally, I think simpler and clearer policies to reflect the smaller scale of development, I think, is critical. But when I say simpler and clearer, I don't mean we should seek to diminish important issues like biodiversity, like climate change issues. But I think clearer policies, shorter policies can probably achieve those changes. Last point, I think planners and decision makers need to have a greater understanding of this sector. I think Andrew's point about cost of brick slips is a very good example. Really, it's critical for us to understand what changes, if we're asking for changes, what is the true cost implication for that change, be it in carbon, be it in financial cost.
Brilliant, thank you, Matthew. I think it's really interesting to hear the kind of story of developing this, developing a house, and particularly a small site, and then the reflections from the planning officer on that. So we wanted to just go back into the groups again. I will try and share these questions with you. Matthew has really laid out, I think, the conflicts in the planning process, different scales of development, but have a look at that. I think, what are the main barriers we see to integrated development? So Andrew really outlined some of the conflicts he came across. Are there any areas where we're seeing conflict between different agendas, and how might we be able to address those? And then, are there any good examples of good practice that you know of? Can you share those, and then we can share those with everyone afterwards? So if someone can be ready to feedback one barrier and one example of good practice, that would be excellent. Great. So if people give a 1 minute summary of sort of key barrier and maybe a good example, that would be excellent. Masha, do you want to lead from your group?
We got straight into the discussion this time.
Well, Hanny, on behalf of Hanny, he says lack of connectedness, because I pointed out, but one of the barriers was the social care system. If that was better, then I would downsize quicker. I'd do it in my 60s instead of my 80s. And the reason I don't do it is because we don't connect housing, social care, health as we should be. We're all siloed.
Thank you very much. Felix, your group?
We went a bit meandering, I think, with our discussion, it was very interesting to sort of tie it back to the question. Some examples of good practice or ways in which development's been done recently. We're looking at places like Isle of Dogs and King's Cross and the sort of regeneration of different parts of London. But then that led into some of the barriers, which potentially can be financial, and also like a community is going to struggle to do things in the same way as a large organization like a government or say Google or HSBC are going to be able to make a change on an area. Yeah, I don't know if you want to hop in on anything, Mark?
I'm not sure we have time, but yeah, exactly. Just not having a kind of strategic plan for dealing with all these issues and the interconnectedness, I think is really important as the next steps.
Brilliant, thank you, Mark H. Was there anyone from your group? And if someone from my group can compare themselves at the same time.
Yeah, we got a little bit lost with a couple of questions, but I think we came up with a couple of answers. Some of the main barriers, have been, funding gaps between various scales and development. Public opposition might resist integrated projects on large-scale developments. Sometimes it's inadequate engagement, other times it's perceived lack of benefits. And a couple of good practices is the place standard tool that's being used across Scotland, which is in conjunction with the Public Health Scotland, which is been given a link, which is really, really good. I'm just having a quick read through it myself now, which helps with a simple tool to structure a conversation about a place, helps people think about physical and social aspects.
Brilliant, Mark.
That's it. Yeah. Okay.
Can you pop that in the chat? I think it's a great example. Yeah. From my group.
Yeah, sure. So I'm in a specialist field of building integrated agriculture, so introducing food production into buildings. One of the things we're doing at the moment is exploring a campaign to introduce a new use class into the TCPO that acknowledges that the kind of new typology requires its own kind of specialist kind of consideration. because otherwise everything gets done by sui generis, and sui generis is expensive, and it becomes a barrier to implementation. And then also you want councils reasonably informed, or at least armed with a framework to be able to evaluate urban food systems in such a way that they don't just panic and say no reflexively.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. It's a very specific case, but I think it's interesting when you're trying to join up these issues, how you need it.
With integrative design, that's where the complexity lies. Yeah.
And you've got planning officers who need to be able to understand all of these issues.
Correct.
Well, thank you very much for all of that feedback. Our intention is to kind of gather as much of that information. Masha will be feeding it back. I'll have over to you in a second, but we will put all of that onto OnePlanet and use that as a way of showing how these issues interlink. For those of you who don't know much about OnePlanet as a tool and would like to learn more, we will do more of just a demo session next week that you're welcome to join. We'll send you information on that. So if you want to learn more about how the tool works, please join that. Masha, did you want to wrap up anything?
Yeah, well, I mean, I would just say a massive thank you again for everyone for joining. I think the richness and diversity of discussion really reflected why it's important to have people from different backgrounds, from different perspectives within the sector coming together. So I'm hopeful that there will be increasing conversations around joining up the process. Obviously, we've got the OnePlanet team who are going to map out the conversations from today, but actually increasingly as the planning's on the radar and in the news, I think whatever role we're taking in our fields, really challenging how we can do this practically is going to be really key. So thank you all, and I'll hopefully catch up with you all again soon.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Brian, did you have any last point you wanted to raise on joining up these issues?
Yeah, thank you everyone for joining. Yeah, I think from our perspective, we are too siloed at the moment. Daniel was saying that, between social care and planning, and Mark was saying that as well. So yeah, so I think joining up the dots can be very useful for us in ensuring that we can respond more rapidly to some of the challenges we've got. And then finally, also, I think if we can show people the bigger picture, that the value of, say, some of these new developments to the bigger picture, which they might be concerned about, might help engage people and reduce opposition in planning. So my dream is that planning becomes a collaborative process rather than a one ridden with conflict. But that's, I think, what we should try and aim for in the next few years. So thank you very much.
If I could just add that point, though, the bigger picture, the government requiring 1.5 million new homes to be built at 300,000 new homes a year, with, for instance, 50,000 new homes around Cambridge alone, there's the bigger picture.
We need to get any of that construction helping to meet all of the different goals we've been identifying here, whether that's addressing carbon issues, but also health issues and equity issues. So thank you for that. Brilliant. So we will share the slides. We will share the information on the sort of follow-up demo we'll be doing on OnePlanet, and putting all of this information into a mind map that you can explore as well. So just about on time. Thank you for everyone's input, and we look forward to being in touch.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.